Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I've got a bit of a personal video for you. A friend of mine found himself on the injured list riding the pine, so I thought painting him something would be a great way to help him get on the mend. And he decided to call in that favor by sending me an STL to print and paint of an owlbear. Now, it's been a while since I've done anything in this scale, but it seemed like a perfect opportunity to kill two birds with one stone and make a video painting it up to a tabletop standard. And while I'm far from a Crystal Brush or Golden Demon winner, that's not going to slow me down from painting up something my friend would be proud to slam onto his table. And as an extra bonus, he'd like me to get nice and gruesome with some gore. So that should be fun. Now, I only have a couple of days to get this done, so I gotta get grooving. I'm gonna grab my brushes. Let's get started. Looking at the figure primed in black, it has three main parts that I want to handle separately: Large Rock, the Buck, and Owlie. Now, whenever I paint, I try to tell a story. There's the moment in time that it represents, and then there's all the moments that came just before. And those are the moments I'm going to try to give hints to while I paint. And that story starts at the bottom. So, Uniform Gray is going to start me off to base the rock. Since it seems to be a single stone, I want to go a bit lighter than I usually do for gray rocks, so I opted for a solid opaque coat for this foundation. Also, with single stones, I tend to like more uniformity, as I imagine the stone would be cleaned regularly by rain, so a stipple wouldn't really work here. I need all of this black covered before I move on. Next up, Nuln Oil. This is an all-over wash for surface details. While I want to maintain a solid gray, I do want the nice surface details to be shown off, especially the large cracks. Because of this, I gave it a second coat to get those blacks nice and inky. Once dry, I had a well-detailed rock, but it was way too dark for my liking. This called for bringing back Uniform Gray as a medium dry brush to push back the shading and lighten the entire plinth. I was careful not to overdo this step and end up painting it back to a flat gray. Now for a first highlight of Ash Gray. This is a fairly light dry brush focused on the top facing surfaces while mostly ignoring the bottom side so that it's left in shadow. This way I get a quick 2 levels of shading without even really trying. But I had to make sure those edges get hit, as light tends to bend around the surface of things, so it should be here too. Once I had some nice crispy edges, I moved on to a final highlight, a spaceship exterior. Now with a feather light application, but once again reserved for the top of the rock, with a slight bit of creep around the edge. Once I was happy, I marked off 1/3 of this model as painted. Looking at the buck, he has some sharp points on the antlers, so I'm guessing this scene is late in the season. That, along with wanting a lighter colored owl, meant this deer should have a darker coat to go along with the composition, so I started basing with oak brown. This is going to give me a nice platform to build up a bit of fur texture. Again, a fully opaque coat was needed, but browns cover very nicely, so one coat and I was ready to move on to leather brown. Now, since I'm going for a fur texture, I don't mind a bit of a scraggly brush, and in fact in some ways it helps. So brush choice doesn't really matter so much here. What does matter is the approach. Since fur tends to have a grain that runs front to back, I started painting back to front in short strokes so that as I moved to the nose, they would overlap in a natural way. Doing it this way is sort of like putting it on easy mode. The real hard part was getting a handle on my fat fingers, as you could see here. I guess this is why so many people use figure holders, but if I'm anything, I'm stubborn. So while I repair this, no, this won't be the last time I break it. For now, onto a slightly lighter leather brown for a second highlight. Here, I'm doing my best to match the angle strokes from the first leather on all of the high points and edges that would catch a little bit more light. This was also a good tone to lighten up the face features as well, like the ears, orbital bone below the eyes, and along the snout. The goal is light scratches that when viewed together, meld into a continuous fur. Now for a bit of light tone to blend everything. No overthinking here, just a thin all over wash and leave it to dry. mouth then got a few swipes of sanguine, followed by a highlight of vermilion on the tongue. And a small dabbing of skeletal bone for the teeth. After it was all said and done, I was getting tons of emotion from that face. It almost even made me sad for it, but no time for tears as more painting needed to be done. So I blacked out the nose and fixed the antler in place for painting. Then I based them in hardened carapace. This is sort of a brownish dark gray that rarely finds its way onto my models, but when it does, it ends up being just the right fit. Once based, I highlighted the points with the skeletal bone. I always liked brighter tips on sharp antlers. They always look more dangerous to me, sort of like the deer's been sharpening them on rocks, just so it can murk somebody that wanders into the forest. I followed it up with a light tone wash, then a touch of bone on the very tip for some extra dangerous points. With the rock and deer done, I'd like to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Your continued support is instrumental in keeping the paint flowing. For that, I can't thank you enough. If you would like to join the Painting Pantheon, you'll find a link to my Patreon in the description below. You can also help support the channel by subscribing here and jamming that like button. That way, we let old Papa YouTube know they should send some more eyes this way. If not, I hope my next video convinces you. For now, we've got a model to finish. Looking at owling, I want to start by choosing what kind of owlbear this is. These paws are giving me major polar bear vibes, and with that stubby beak, slightly cute expression, and a crown of feathers, I'm seeing a sparrow owl for the bird side. Thankfully, they both share an off-white cream color, so they should work well together. So I pulled out the skeletal bone again and began basing. Now at first, I was only going to do the fur and have all brown feathers, but it just made more sense in my head to paint the whole thing like a polar bear and then paint the bird on top of it. So working in sections, the body and feathers got based, save for a strip down its back. For that, I pulled out the lighter leather brown as I was 100% sure I wanted him to have a mohawk. After everything was dry, I thinned down some light tone to give it an all-over wash. Thinning it down a bit lowers the surface tension and gives you a bit of insurance from coffee staining, but it did take an extra 2 passes before I got the shading I was looking for. Then I dry brushed on the skeletal bone to knock back the shadows and re-establish the cream tone. I chose to keep a bit more shade around his paws for a bit of weathering, while the face got nearly a rebasing, with the shade only visible in the hard recesses. Now for a highlight, a foggy gray. I put this on fairly light just to brighten up the peaks a step closer to a cool white, which I think is a happy medium between the two animals. And don't worry if you get a touch of this on the mohawk, as it ends up mimicking the bird's model feathers anyways. If this was an off color, I would say repaint it, but here it works, so happy accidents. Now looking at the owl side, I wanted to go dark for the feathers with oak brown. While I liked the leather brown, I felt it needed a stronger color for the dark feathers crowning his face. This resulted in a very mane-like appearance, which is fitting for the action of the scene. Once the ring was done, I picked out random feathers to do on the inner crown. You're going to want to paint clean here to not soil the nice creams we've already laid down. But if you have a shaking hand moment like I did, just paint the overspill feather too. Problem solved. Now, these dark feathers were looking a bit one note, so I grabbed the lighter leather brown to accent the tips a bit. This way I can tie these main feathers in with the mohawk down his back. Needing a mental break from the feathers, I blacked out the paws, beak, and eyes. This was the point Owlie here started looking pretty cute. Look at those little feet, I just want to squish them. the cuteness break over, I went back to the feathers with oak brown, being sure to paint both sides this time. But it was not long before I needed another feather break, so I hopped over to blacking out the claws. Sometimes in this hobby, there are some tedious bits, and as much as I love the process, there are some parts that are less than fantastic. For me, it's repetition. So having little side jobs to do to break up these parts definitely helps keep me moving forward. If you feel yourself getting burnt out on a step, try doing something else and coming back to it with fresh eyes. Which means back to the feathers for me, this time with some thinned down light tone. This was to get a bit of definition on the darker parts and a bit more brown in the light feathers. This way they're slightly darker than the fur. After a few passes, I was ready to finish off the face, starting with the eyes. First thing to do is to pick where he's looking, and in this case, it would be at his prey, so right about here. And since his eyes are black, I'm just going to use a bit of light gray to mark where the pupils should be. There, that looks good. Starting with light leather brown, I began blocking out the eyes. Now owls have irises that take up nearly the entire eye, so I went for about 80% here. The focus should be on getting that outer edge in the correct place. The inner edge can be cleaned up later. Next, I went back over this with gold base to start lighting it up, leaving a very thin ring of that leather along the outer edge. This was followed by deep yellow as a final highlight, and then I blacked out the pupils. Next, the eyelids got some attention with uniform and then ash gray. And just like the deer, I used vermilion to flesh up the tongue. And skeletal bone for the teeth. Come on, look at this cutie. This looks like a Disney owlbear. Like it could have been in that movie, The Three Caballeros. Or is that just me? Either way, dry fitting everything together, it was looking good and pretty much done. Now, fair warning, it's gonna get gruesome from this point on. And if you don't want to see that, I'd stop the video here. Because now it's time for the dark part of this story with a bit of blood for the blood god. In my story, the deer has been mortally injured some time back and staggered up to this rock, so I want to drip some decently sized drops. Then, to show that the deer slipped and skidded through its own blood, I drug a toothpick across each one towards the bottom of the rock. Over here is where it finally fell under the predator's grip. So it seems like a good place to have a mess of tissue spilled out on the ground. I made this using a bit of toilet paper and Elmer's glue. Now, you don't want a ton of glue, you just want enough so that the paper is saturated. Once I was happy with the placement and texture, I dabbed on some blood until everything was at least tinted. You want a bit of messy randomness here, as it just adds to the gore. Once the glue was fully dry, I gave the rock a second blood treatment, this time putting in a small stream of blood. Fluids like to take the path of least resistance, so try to always follow the steepest path down. Once I got to the edge, I widened it a bit, sort of like how rivers widen out into a delta when they empty into the sea. The stream was looking a little too undisturbed, first with toothpicks to simulate hooves, then with the tip of my finger to simulate bear pads. I just don't want to overdo it. This is where the fight ended, not where it started. For Bambi, I decided to go with the darkest timeline. I wanted to show that when he got to this rock, he ended up getting tripped up on his own intestines. To do this, I'll need a flap of tissue that goes across the belly and a tube looping around his foot and tucked underneath his body. This will save me from having to try and sculpt the wound. For those guts, I just twisted up some paper very tight and then doused it in glue. And yeah, I broke the antler again. Told you I would. Don't worry, I'll fix it. After I got the tube into a good position, I set it down on this parchment and realized I did not hit record. Thankfully, it wasn't that riveting of an experience. But as usual, before the glue dried, I stippled on some blood god to really make it gruesome. Then I applied the flesh flap to hide that the tubes were going under. Finally, I fixed the antler and then added a bit of gore as detail and as a secret splint. This should be the last time it happens. Looking at the owl, I only really wanted artery spray, so I loaded up a brush and grabbed a straw. Using quick bursts of air will give you a fast, semi-random mist of blood. The further away from the model you are, the wider the pattern and harder you'll need to blow. I did my best to keep his face clean, mainly because I've never seen a messy owl face, but also because he's just so darn cute. With everything put together, it was looking quite murderous, but I want to add just a little bit more something. So I grabbed some Uhu for some nice sticky trails of fluids. This is one of those less is more elements, so you'll want to use this sparingly. Once I get a small bead of the glue on a toothpick, I have a few seconds to touch 2 points that I want to connect. I knew I definitely wanted a connection from the belly to the guts. And then a little bit more on this other leg as it's kicking through the mess. Just this little bit adds so much more action to the scene. For Owly, I reserved this just as a little bit of drool in his open mouth to hopefully show how hungry this bear is. And with that, it was done. And wow, this came out great! The bear ended up with almost a joyful expression with those happy eyes, kind of like a cat enjoying playing with his meal before he gives it the coup de grace. Super cute, but also super deadly. Unfortunately, I don't have a link to where you can get your hands on this STL, but if I get that link from my buddy, I'll be sure to update the description with it. Overall, I had a good time painting this one, even under the time crunch. I hope my friend enjoys slamming this down on the table one day. As for me, I've got a certain angry Canadian X-Men that's waiting to get painted, so I've got to go. But until next time, thanks for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.